thanks very much for inviting me, and also thanks for coming to this lecture theatre. I understand it's a bit out of the way for you. I hope we're going to do it without a mic, so I hope you guys at the back can hear okay, but give me a shout if not, and I'll speak up a bit louder. I know that this series of lectures is called On the Edge of Architecture, or Edges of Architecture, and so I thought in putting this together tonight I might talk about something which was maybe seen as being on the periphery of architecture, which is the architecture of fashion and retail. And that's something that my practice is called 6A Architects. I'm one of the directors there. We're a studio based in London, about 30 people. And fashion and retail is something that we don't do a lot of, but we have done it quite consistently over the years since we started. In fact, our first ever project was a flagship store. And in a way, we also don't really speak about it publicly. This is, I think, the first public lecture on this subject, of our work on this subject. And in some ways, I think it's because it seems being on the edge of architecture. It's, I suppose, in opposition to the traditional values of architecture. So rather than being monumental and built forever, or kind of as close to as forever as we might be able to get, it's instead very transient. It's fast to design, it's quite fast to build, and also it just basically has a shorter lifespan. And I think in a way there's an implication that this somehow reduces the significance of it, kind of the architectural and cultural significance. And I think that actually I feel really quite strongly that that's not the case, and that's quite an incorrect case. As we know, the world is kind of constantly changing, and I think fashion is a really useful lens for the architect to kind of see the speed of change, because fashion is a discipline which is really reactive and really responsive. And also, in a way, historically, if we think about like Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, when they went to Las Vegas and looked at the Strip, they kind of showed us that the world of like the commercial vernacular was really a strong force in how it shaped that city and how it shapes our architecture. And in a way, I feel like fashion, whether you kind of feel like you follow fashion or you don't, it doesn't really matter, because fashion itself is a fundamentally very strong force that shapes our environment, it shapes our landscapes, it shapes our buildings, our cities, and even our laws. And at the same time, as you can see, it kind of comes in lots of different guises. So it can be really glamorous, it can kind of be quite humorous, and hopefully also it oscillates between being kind of trivial and also being really quite serious at times. I also think today there's a real urgency to think about it, because the fashion industry produces about 8% of all annual CO2. Now, this, I think, is a really important statistic for architects, because 8% is also what the construction industry produces every year, that kind of annual CO2. So we have these kind of two giant industries, fashion and architecture. I think both will shape our planet going forwards. They shape our future and our planet's future. I think the questions of kind of how we live and what we live in, both clothes and buildings, and how they're both produced, they're going to be dramatically questioned kind of in my lifetime, in your lifetimes going forwards. And I suppose to start thinking about fashion, we got to think about the thing that's not in this image, which is fabric. And I'd kind of encourage us to see fabric as a natural resource. And obviously it's or kind of a natural resource and a product of agriculture. It's not obviously naturally produced. It's instead a product of kind of many different processes. So maybe in this kind of diagram you can see this side being kind of farming and agriculture side, so the growing or rearing of fibers, then spinning them together to make a yarn, and then weaving the yarn to make fabric, and then finally the kind of fashioning of the cloth to make it into garments. And I suppose all of those processes are kind of very human activities. And I think that's in a way what gives it its kind of potency culturally and architecturally. And I think to go back, until synthetics were invented, so viscose was invented in the 1890s, but kind of most synthetic fabrics weren't around until the 1920s and onwards. So in all the time before that, all fabrics were made from natural fibers. So we're talking about wood, wool, linen,
cotton, silks, a few others. But generally those four and the cultivation of those four have dramatically shaped our landscapes. So fields are seeded, harvested for cotton and linen. Mulberry groves are planted throughout Asia for silkworms. And also trade routes are set up between the different continents, both land and sea routes. And these are to pass commodities and products, but they also pass knowledge and they pass ideas around the world. But perhaps most strikingly, I think, for the British Isles is medieval England. And the main textile trading in medieval England was the passing of wool. So this is kind of the 11th and 12th century. It was basically across the breadth of England. And at that point in time, Flanders, so the lowlands, Belgium, Netherlands, they were the best, really the best in the world, the best in Europe at weaving. And they would weave a lot of incredible textiles that were mostly wool-based, but also intertwined with some silks that would come through the Silk Road, and even some precious metal in turned yarns. And they kind of, in those cities like Ghent and Bruges, their whole fortunes were based on this industry of wool weaving. And the fashion, particularly the fashion in the UK for kind of tapestries and cloths and wall lining, this is Hampton Court Palace in London on the right. But this fashion and the desire for it was so strong that actually it outstripped all of the supply of wool in the lowlands in Flanders, and they began to import wool, particularly from England, from the north of England. And this inspired, I suppose, one of several firsts. It was the first large-scale capitalist industry, but it was also the first act of land privatization in the UK. So the Tudor monarchy at that time decided to start replacing kind of common grazing pastures with enclosed fields for the rearing of sheep. And this effectively changed the arrangement, management, and ownership of the countryside forever. And it's still, to this day, the pattern more or less exists. So they progressively kind of subdivided and enclosed the British landscape. And it was later actually formalized in a series of laws, which were called the Enclosure Acts. It's much later on. So we see maybe for the first time fashion driving legislation to do with landscapes. But it wasn't just landscapes that kind of fashion had an influence on. Fashion and textiles also drove urbanization very strongly. If you think about towns like Halifax, Huddersfield, Bolton, Paisley, all of those towns really massively grew from the industrialization of textiles. And that, I suppose, it marks a shift as well from textiles being made in the countryside, kind of as a part of a rural economy, subsistence textile production, to them being made in towns. Particularly because of the invention of things like the spinning jenny, which were like water-powered ability to spin multiple yarns at the same time, rather than the fairy tale spinning wheel. But I'm going to talk maybe about a part of London which 200 years before the Industrial Revolution, we could see maybe fashion already shaping the city. This is Aga's map of London from the 1560s. And over the next 100 years, that area in pink would become effectively London's first new town. And that was a new town that was settled and powered because of the fashion industry. So it was, importantly, it was outside of the city walls, because inside the city was protected by a lot of the guilds. So this area in pink was the open fields around the hospital, and it would later become known as Spitalfields, so a kind of portmanteau of those words. And it was settled quite extensively by Huguenot Protestants when they were escaping persecution from France. So they moved to this area in significant numbers, in fact moved to lots of parts of the UK, but most predominantly in London. And actually the word refugee, the first use of that word was to describe the Huguenots arriving in England. And they were kind of immensely talented silk weavers, and this area soon became really the go-to place for fashion in the country. It had kind of the finest silks, the most colourful, the most kind of exciting bespoke clothes. And you can see, if I zoom in on the map, you can see that even the place names reflect the purposes. So we've got, on the left, we've got Petticoat Lane, and then on the right, we've got Fashion Street, and in the middle, we've got Smock Alley. So people would specifically go to this part of London to buy or commission these types of fashionable pieces. And the silk merchants were very wealthy and lived in very large townhouses. And the kind of typology of the townhouse was that on the ground floor and lower floors would be the shops. And then above that, they would have the looms, which would be making the silks. Also in other parts, in other less kind of major streets, they'd be producing cloth. And this is William Hogarth's etching. It's called The Fellow Prentices at Their Looms, which shows maybe a typical arrangement. This is one such pair of silk mercers' houses. It was built in the 1690s, but it was kind of really extensively remodeled in 1754 by two Huguenot merchants. This is a photograph of it from the archive in around the 1960s. The buildings live on Smock Alley, so highlighted in pink here. Smock Alley was actually later renamed Raven Row and then Artillery Lane. And I suppose the names are a bit of a clue to the future of Spitalfields, which then went into decline. Its textile industry went into decline in the centuries to come. And 6A were invited to convert and refurbish the buildings into a contemporary art centre. That's the front, the section to the cross section through the building and all the front. So you can see the lower levels are kind of the shop and the piano nobile, and then it gets progressively more simplified where the looms would have been. And we also excavated below the historic building and below a 1970s office building, a kind of new subterranean gallery spaces with top light coming through the middle. So you can see in plan there's two new gallery spaces and then the historic rooms in the front. And that's the view of the rear gallery space with the top light, roof lights above. And then the upper floors retained they were converted into exhibition rooms as well in the historic rooms. And I suppose it was quite a careful restoration that tried not to simply just overwrite, but it was trying to kind of have the good with also the neglected parts and kind of show some of the rubbing up of the different lives and histories of the buildings. So we can see also in some of the archive photos really how wealthy the silk merchants had been. Spitalfields was exceptionally influential as well politically. So they passed, they managed to negotiate the passing of laws to protect their enterprises. In 1699, they successfully banned the importation of Indian calico. So Indian calicos were a much cheaper version, but they were very colourful. And they had been a fashionable trend, and the silk weavers kind of ended all that by getting Parliament to pass an act. And they did the same for an outright ban of all European-made silks. That was in 1766. So that effectively stopped the importation of any silk from France or Italy. And that meant that London was basically dominating the market, and the interiors reflected their wealth. So maybe that's when we see again fashion kind of driving legislation. That said, so these are some of the amazing interiors and our restoration of the rooms. But that said, after the laws were repealed, the industry effectively collapsed for that and a few other reasons. And Spitalfields never really got back its kind of swagger, probably until maybe the kind of financial system of the 2000s expanded the city into Spitalfields. So even up to the kind of 1980s, 1990s, it was really quite run down. Also in the 1970s, there were two fires in the building. They ripped right through it. And parts of that were remade, have been remade. But also the kind of textures of the fire started us making a kind of new architectural language for our new insertions. So these are the roof lights above the lower gallery space. And they're clad in this charred, it's like a charcoal cladding, which is both insect-proof and weather-proof. And then even kind of hot sand-cast handles that were done at the foundry. They kind of all reflect the memory of the fires. And then a couple of years after we finished the buildings, we were invited to work with this artist, this Seth Siegelau, to make an exhibition about textiles. I say artist because Seth, he actually wasn't an artist. He was, I suppose he was a curator of sorts. But he was one of the most important figures in the conceptual art movement of the kind of 1960s and 1970s. He was born in Brooklyn in 1949, and he started running a gallery in the 1960s. And he basically worked with that wave of people who would become conceptual artists, like Sol LeWitt, Lawrence Weiner, Carl Andre. So he's quite a figure, I think, of interest in the art world, and also quite elusive, because he then left the art world entirely in 1972, vanished more or less, and in the 80s he began a collection of textiles, and his collection, it's about 650 pieces, and it goes from really ancient Egyptian Coptic fabrics through to the Renaissance silks and velvets, and even to kind of things, more contemporary things he found from the 20th century, like bark cloth and printed and dyed things he found in flea markets near where he lived. And each of them was really intensively catalogued with hypotheses and extensive notes about the origins of them. I suppose because effectively he had a very profound interest in the kind of cultural and social significance of textiles. And I'm just going to read something that he wrote as part of the exhibition catalogue. It's, textiles have played a very special role in the history of humanity because of their unique and contradictory dual character. They are at the same time very delicate and vulnerable to the natural elements in human use on the one hand, while on the other hand, they are very rugged, resilient, and portable as objects of transport. The perfect combination of costliness, lightweight, and durability of silk made it a very profitable object of trade, along with spices, gems, and other products which share these physical characteristics. And with this trade, an essential means of communication for motifs, designs, cultural values, and ideas, as well as the power behind them. In this sense, the historic durability of textiles is very similar to that of architecture, but instead of immutable and heroic remains physically linked to a particular place, we have mobile textile fragments. And his text made me think of this image, which is in Architecture Without Architects by Bernard Rudofsky, but also Semper's famous declaration that the beginning of building coincides with the beginning of textiles. So somehow I suppose the history of the two are really certainly interlinked, and perhaps at some point we were much closer, builders and architects much closer in understanding the two together. That's slightly an aside, but our exhibition displayed there the Spitalfields edicts, the laws which forbade silks. And alongside that, we showed a collection of silks which would have been banned by the Act, so mostly French and Italian silks from the 17th and 18th century. These were arranged across 4 large tables in the rear galleries. And actually they were arranged so that the warp ran in one direction and the weft ran in the other direction. So somehow I suppose it was maybe tapping into Seth's background and maybe our thinking that we would arrange it not by name, not by location, not by age, but arrange them more spatially with kind of this overlay. And in that way we try to avoid kind of the typical museological categorizations of fabric. Instead we also group them by color. And we also included Seth's kind of meticulous notes on the origins. And in the rear room, there's a series of headdresses that he'd also collected, mostly from the Pacific Islands. And we suspended these in the room at roughly about head height, also so you got a kind of idea for the figure around them. And then we arranged other fabrics throughout the building according to the uses, the historic uses of the building, so the kind of finest and most ancient fabrics on the piano nobile. And then as we went up into the top of the building up here, and we put the lace and linen collection, this would be the original linen cupboard of the building. So in a way, I suppose we were trying to apply a kind of loose taxonomy of the textiles and trying to tie, I suppose, their kind of unknown histories with the invisible lives of the people who would have been in the building as well. So kind of putting place and collection together again. And you can see a few of the final images here. And then the front Rococo cast iron balustrades of the original building. So that very decorative piece along the top. They were stolen in the 1960s and we think melted down for scrap because we couldn't find them when we did the original refurbishment. So for the facade of the new galleries on the rear, we made a new cast iron facade. And this was actually on it's quite an aptly named street. It's on Frying Pan Alley, the back. And in a way, I suppose this kind of a material translation as well of the kind of very fragile and delicate charcoal then flipped to becoming this quite robust, quite hard-wearing metal surface for the street. And then a few years later, we were able to revisit cast iron for a new shopfront for the fashion designer Paul Smith. And the store, it was basically on the other side of London, so it was on in Mayfair, in this kind of very historic shopping district. And Mayfair essentially has been a place for luxury goods and clothing since the 19th century. And so it has kind of all the trappings of late Georgian and Victorian retail. How did they sell, basically? So it has things like grand arcades and vitrine windows. And actually, vitrine windows were developed by the Victorians so that the light would be, the glare and the reflection wouldn't obstruct the thing in the middle of the window. So these kind of billow shapes. The building that Paul wanted us to look at was actually a pastiche of Georgian architecture. So it's that brown one with the rusticated base. It was actually built in the 1980s and it has a concrete frame behind all that brickwork. And our brief was really to transform the building with a new shop front at the bottom, but keeping the office use above and trying to transform the whole building in one move, effectively. And I suppose a big part of maybe working in fashion is understanding the brand. And for Paul Smith, it's really about people and very much about Paul himself. He still runs the business. He's still very important in the design of the product. But yeah, at the same time, what was a small tailor shop in London has now become a huge kind of global brand. But their work, some of you might know it, it's kind of quite close to English traditional tailoring. So it's quite well cut, it's quite well made, but it also has some elements of idiosyncrasy. So kind of unusualness and a kind of certain individualism that comes from him. So and this is his office, kind of a collage of his office. So it's full of artifacts. Some of them related to fashion, most of them kind of other things, other experiments, other things. And that was kind of our starting point for this. So it's trying to combine these two worlds, one of like a tradition and a continuity on one hand, and then on the other side a kind of curiosity and inquisitiveness. And in a way, our starting point was seeing cast iron as a kind of background fabric to London and many other cities in the UK. So it's below ground, drain pipes. Then it comes up as manhole covers, pavement lights, also balustrades and railings and kind of bits of Victorian decoration. And I suppose it's kind of everywhere you look, but it's also at the same time very much overlooked. It's kind of little recognized, and I think for us that was also a bit like a good suit. Like you shouldn't really see it, but you see it. So from there we experimented, and we did a lot of work into like looking at weave patterns. And these were some straw hats that Paul Smith gave us from his collection, and also some jacquard prints. There was this kind of ghost of Semper, I think, asking if we could generate an architecture from kind of weave patterns. But we also looked at more unusual examples as a building kind of made from clothes. So this is an anorak seller in Germany, displaying his wares on the front. And then we started kind of physically experimenting with the, excuse me, not at all. Wrong lecture. We started experimenting with the surface texture, so casting against ropes, casting nets in plaster and then trying to keep them three-dimensionally stable. And one of the big things was we were looking for something which from afar, from the street, far down the street would do something. And then when you got up close, it would get even more interesting. It would kind of start having haptic and visual quality. So kind of how things sat, how things were impressed into surfaces. All of these things. And in a way, I suppose Mayfair is quite a specific set piece in London's architectural history. And so we looked again also at what was around, what was the language. And we find this circular motif interlocking circles. And then we thought, okay, what if we took that motif and then kind of compressed it even further? And it's started to look a little bit like a weave. It started to look a little bit like a kind of texture that's set across the facade, and particularly playing with the sunlight and the shadows. It kind of had a certain grain that maybe resonated both with the kind of historic architecture and as well as the kind of fabric studies that we had been doing. And we chose not to make typical window openings of a shop front. I suppose normal retail is to have big glass windows. Instead, we set out a series of small vitrines, and they were really good, I think, at framing the product, but also framing the observer into the window and kind of situating you with the view in. The windows themselves, they were actually made by a car windscreen manufacturer, because they're the people who kind of know how to curve glass nowadays. All the glass smithers of Victorian times have long gone. And then on the right of the image there, you can see it's actually a fire escape door to the offices above. And here it's cut with the inverse pattern of the cast iron panel. So it kind of flips between positive and negative. And also it switches from light and timber to being kind of heavy and metallic. And in a way, I think it's quite a nice metaphor because it also relates to the process of how cast iron is made, which essentially starts with a mold. And here we digitally modeled it and then CNC'd these shapes, these panels. That's then pressed into a sand bed, literally sand, and it's coated with a graphite solution, that's the black stuff, which is then burnt off. That kind of works like a release agent to help the things separate when they come out of the mold. Then the molten metal gets poured into the sand molds. And this is really quite complex because as the hot metal flows, it also cools. So then it starts to have different viscosities and so on. And also it gives out a lot of heat. So there's these hot gases escaping through chimneys that they make within the sand bed. You can see them here. And then finally, it kind of comes out of the mold and it's weathered and then installed on the facade. And because it's cast from sand, we could kind of make marks in the castings. So we cast in 3 of Paul Smith's own hand drawings. So there's a shoe, and then a bird, and finally there's a cat. And also, I think Paul Smith is quite a unique brand, also its logo, because it's probably one of the only to be the founder's signature. So we cast Paul Smith's signature into the door reveal. So this is the entrance on the left, and his name. And then a couple of years later emerged some leather goods, and then some swimwear. And actually for us, I think it was a really lovely thing because it meant that the architectural language that we found had a resonance with the brand's fashion design themselves and their kind of creative output from their own studio. But in a way, those last 2 projects, Paul Smith Boutique and Spittlefield's weavers' shops, they're essentially the same thing. They're these kind of fashionable boutiques which have very decorative and ornamental facades, and in a way those facades are proxies for the product. So it's like trying to make one bit of architecture talk about the thing that you're also making. And I think fashion, or the world of retail design, quite often says, oh, we're looking for the next new thing, and this kind of world of hype. Whereas actually there's much, much more continuity in the history of retail design than I think gets credit for, over centuries of kind of how to make retail and how to sell things. But that said, there's also really big, really momentous shifts that come around every so often. And I think if you walk just up from this street, you come to Selfridges. And Selfridges was one of those buildings which really changed the nature of retail. It's, as you can see in this image in the construction, it's built with a steel frame and then concrete infill. And basically, the Selfridges and the Ritz were the first buildings in London and the UK to build with a steel frame. And the benefit for retail, so it came out of, I suppose, the Chicago skyscraper boom, and Harry Gordon Selfridge was a Chicago businessman. But the big benefit was that they could make huge department halls with big volumes. And that was something that London had never seen, the UK had never seen before. But the problem was that the London or the British building regulations were all geared up for fire compartmentation. So they prohibited a certain cubic volume. You couldn't go beyond it. And that was all to do with the Great Fire of London from the 1660s. And kind of, I suppose, a fear of fire, which has always plagued London. But it's also to do with, I suppose, the expectation that we would be building structures from timber and from masonry, and they only have spans of a certain distance, whereas now it was possible to do spans of a much bigger distance. So actually what Selfridge had to do was lobby Parliament to change the building regs. And after many years of trying, also in collaboration, I think, with the Ritz, they managed to alter the building regs. And again, I suppose it's a way of seeing fashion as something that drives legislation. So it's not this kind of airy-fairy separate thing. It's really it shapes our kind of democracies. And these are some of the kind of amazing halls that they produced. It also, I mean, it opened in 1909. And it wasn't just, I think, an architectural development. It was also a development in how do you sell. So, for instance, they had elevators. They also had electric lighting, so they could light the shop fronts all through the evening and night in, I suppose, what we would call visual merchandising nowadays. And they were kind of really pushing new techniques for retail. And even so much that a few months after it opened, this is a French pilot called Louis Blériot, and he was the first man to fly over the channel. And Selfridges brought the monoplane and put it in the ground floor salon. So they really knew how to drive kind of spectacle and entertainment as well as transact. It's not just contemporary brands who do that now. Selfridges were doing it 100 years ago. And this exhibition, this is a photograph from an exhibition in Garage in Moscow. It's on at the moment. It's not of Selfridges, but I kind of think it's quite a wonderful example of these sales techniques that I'm talking about. You know, you've got the salesman using his own tie to sell shirt material to the customer. But in a way, also I think the retail model, kind of I suppose the sales model probably progresses much, much faster than the architecture can keep up with. So maybe a really good example is that we go from the salesman with a tie to no salesperson at all, effectively. So from the late 90s and the 2000s, we saw the rise of e-commerce. And in 2001, which is the year that this advert came out from Apple, 6A designed a flagship store for a new fashion brand called Oki. And Oki, they made rare products and really limited edition runs, and a lot of it was collaborations with other fashion houses and with sports brands. But basically all of it was only available online. And this was a time, I suppose, when e-commerce was just being pioneered. So it was really quite unknown. How do you put like physical bricks and mortar alongside a digital platform? And maybe to give it a bit of context, 2001 was the store. The first iPhone wasn't invented until 2007. Okay, so it was quite and it was a very new kind of pioneering world at that point, e-commerce generally. And the Oki store was somewhere that essentially you couldn't buy anything. At least you couldn't walk out the door with something. Instead, you could touch it and try it on and use it almost like a showroom, and then you would use the laptops in the store to order product to your home or anywhere around the world. The shop itself was on Savile Row, and for those of you who know, it's Savile Row is the kind of the home of English tailoring. It's where you get bespoke suits. So in a way, it's probably the only other street in the world where you can't buy something and take it home with you that day. It's somewhere where you have to wait and get your suit measured and so on and come back. So it kind of culturally located the store in the right place. The store itself was designed with this fan-shaped oak tray which sat within the existing unit, and then the sea of felt sitting on top of it. And it was actually sloped, so it acted almost like this kind of proscenium arch to the 3 big windows so that you could see the interior from the street. And on the ground sat these big piles of felt, and they were almost like abstracted forms of domesticity, so they were the same height as a bed. And then there were clothing laid out on them, hung from the walls. In a way, it was a bit like your bedroom facade had been peeled off and the street could see in. Also of note, I think, was that it stripped away all of the conventions of retail. So there was no cash desk, there were no shelving racks, there was only a sparse number of products, and they were only in one size. All the rest were hidden away. And also that it was kind of a very haptic place. It was very materially led. It was somewhere, hopefully, that you would stay and touch and linger. And that was really quite uncommon in retail at that time. I think now, I suppose a generation later, though, e-commerce is a staple. And all the novelty and confusion of Okini, people would turn up and get incredibly angry that they couldn't take something away. And that they had to use a laptop to order something. And now I think all that has changed. In fact, the way we shop has entirely changed. And I think rather than it being like a negative for the physical store, I think it means that the physical stores are now being much more experimental in a way. And our most recent store is a shop called Blue Mountain School. And that's a kind of umbrella term which covers a fashion boutique, a restaurant. It has a perfumery, an art gallery as well. And in a way, that's the building. In a way, they've been open for 10 years, and they've probably seen the whole emergence of e-commerce and been people really on top of it. But also what they've seen, I think, is a rapid speeding up of the fashion industry. So probably 10 years ago, we had like 2 to 4 seasons a year. Now we're on probably a minimum of 8. But actually, it's increasingly like perpetual drops of products. So basically, every 6 weeks, there's something new and something over here, and it's quite, it's like a speed that's been led by e-commerce in a way. And also alongside that, we've seen the rise of fast fashion. So more consumers, and we're buying more product than we ever have done before. And at Blue Mountain, of course, everything is available online. But in a way, just as fashion houses are trying to speed up, I feel like Blue Mountain School are trying to slow it all back down again. And they're trying to kind of situate works alongside other artifacts which give them a different type of cultural meaning. So things like textiles and tapestries, ceramics. And they also commission specific artists and designers to make a very limited edition one-off pieces, treating it kind of almost analogous to artworks. And this is Amy Revier, who uses a hand loom to weave individual pieces. So when they asked us to expand the building, we talked a lot about the House Museum as a model. So things like the Soame Museum, because effectively these were kind of very personal collections of objects, which when put beside each other, they took on certain meanings, kind of cross-cultural meanings, and kind of generated their own types of stories. And that seemed to have quite a resonance with what Blue Mountain School were trying to achieve. They also had this great kind of spatial exuberance, so big double-height spaces, and this kind of interior world which was maybe hidden from the world outside, normally with a relatively kind of prosaic interior. So we kind of took the idea of the Soame model and thought about what if we could like concertina it into a townhouse shape. And so this is the section of the building, and these are kind of the big rooms, so the big double height spaces or triple height spaces in the room, alongside the more domestic scaled rooms that are set around it. We also did a few kind of absolute no-nos in the world of fashion retailing. So the first one, it kind of turns its back on the street, and we replaced all the windows with very highly reflective glazing, so it was really difficult to kind of look inside. You just saw yourself in the street. And then the other thing we did was we took out the floor slab at the ground floor near the entrance, and that is like the golden square meters of shopping. They're like the most high value real estate in stores. And instead what we did was we sunk this clothing archive into the basement, so it became one of these double height spaces. And there were bespoke sliding steel units that we designed, which filled up with the archive, but also had the other artifacts, some of the other artifacts scattered within them. And visitors would have to book in to come and see these. And it's a shoppable archive. It's also available online. You can see some images here. And there were lots of views down into the archive as well, so you could see people browsing and so on. And then through the archive, there's a perfumery. This is Perfumer H, set out onto this terrazzo table. And then there's a staircase that takes you up to the kitchen. It's an open kitchen on the first floor. And then there's a dining room which serves only one sitting an evening, and it's everyone at the same time around a communal 14-person table. So it kind of breathes a kind of community and a conviviality. There's also a wine room. And then we go up again, and there's the double height space as an art gallery space. And then a series of smaller rooms for exhibitions, smaller scales parts. And then adjacent, there's the last double height room, which is a kind of specific room for a designer called BDW, who they're an American designer in New York. And there's a series of room sets also, not just by, well, we were responsible for the building, but a series of other people we knew were doing works within the building. So on the top floor, there's a kind of music room which overlooks the city. This is designed by Valentin Lohlmann, German designer. And the thing that kind of pins it all together is this oak staircase. And the oak staircase, it runs from ground floor right up to the top of the building. And it's built from this kind of very monolithic oak. So basically one material doing structure, tread, balustrade, virtually everything. But it also just so happened that the client had quite a big store of oak. So we were kind of almost reverse designing, seeing what materials we had and then designing the staircase to suit. And it was quite a complex stair, but because we had like quite a lot of the material, we could basically live test it as we went. So piecing together, this is one of the really complex winders that also work as a landing. And actually the client ended up publishing the engineer's drawings in their very first publication. This is acts like a guide to the whole building. So here we are basically choosing the beams, trying to get the straightest ones for the main spans. And here it is being installed. That's the staircase going up. And this is Wayne, the joiner. In fact, he built the whole building. And this was really quite a special thing because we worked in a really collaborative way with Wayne and with the client to design the building almost as we went. It was kind of like a research project where we could do something, analyze it, change it. And that's very unusual in architecture because normally there are so many layers of contractual relationships with other people that you don't really get this direct relationship. So we could do things in quite a different way. One example maybe is this was the prototype for the balustrade, and we didn't really like how the top rail looked. It looked really domestic. And so we changed the thickness so that we had these very big monolithic balusters. But the problem was as they dried out, they would twist. And so what Wayne started doing, he put these blocking pieces between them to try to hold them as they twisted and try to keep them straight. And basically when we saw it, we said, oh, this is great. Can we just change the softwood for oak and then we'll just keep it? And that became the balustrade detail that you can see this kind of interlocking elements between the main verticals. And I suppose a lot of that project was about detail and about trying to get the details right. So partially, I think, because we had a very reduced palette of materials. So we're basically using oak plaster. We have two types of plaster, pink or gray, and then galvanized steel. And somehow that quite reduced palette had to do the whole building, and it had to satisfy all the uses, all those different uses in the building. We also, where possible, we kept kind of fragments of the building work exposed. We didn't cover it up in the end. So you can see that circle and the bit of plasterboard, scuffed plasterboard below the oak stair. And when we made a hole in the basement, we then kept the reveals kind of exposed. And I suppose some of the thinking was that the building, it was maybe to suggest that the building's kind of unfinished in the same way that the archive is unfinished, and the archive is always collecting and evolving, and all the activities of the building are also changing and carrying on, and hopefully we carry on working and doing things to the building. And we even made the pegs to hold the clothes. So these are different types of clay which form these kind of abstract faces that hang the clothes. And they kind of reminded me of the masks of Saul Steinberg. Some of you probably know Saul Steinberg. I think he's a kind of master of illustration. He used to work for the New Yorker. And he was kind of a master of actually depicting society and depicting kind of the art movements, but also kind of cultural movements, subcultural movements, counterculture movements. And it made me think also of this kind of idea of fashion as being helpful in defining collective identity as much as it is in making an individual identity, because we kind of also want to try to group together in our fashion subcultures. And we were asked to design a show with the British fashion designer Jonathan Anderson for the Hepworth Museum in Wakefield. And we showed them as a starting point this illustration by Saul Steinberg. It's called Techniques at a Party #1. And it basically depicts modern art movements as if they were people at a cocktail party. And this, I think for us, it was kind of a good starting point as a metaphor for the show, because the show was about combining very significant pieces of art and iconic pieces of fashion that all talked about human figure and form and somehow the human body. So it was this sort of kind of huge group show. These are some of the works that ranged from different art periods and different iconic fashion pieces. So it included things like pieces from the collection at Wakefield, so Hepworth and Henry Moores, also kind of modernist, real, extremely incredible modernist piece like Giacometti, Brancusi, Joan Arp, also later artists like Dorothea Tanning, Louise Bourgeois, and then more contemporary pieces on the left, Sarah Lucas on the right, and Magali Royce. And then it was to combine them with a series of fashion pieces, some of them older, some of them more contemporary, like Dior, Rei Kawakubo from Comme des Garçons, Yves Saint Laurent, and Issey Miyake, amongst others. And I think for us, the Issey Miyake image on the right was really interesting because I suppose because we were working in fashion, because it was with Jonathan Anderson, we were almost able to subvert the typical museum conventions. So you didn't have to obey all the curatorial procedures. So could we put things on a bed, drape it over a chair? Could we put a sculpture on the floor rather than on a plinth? Those kind of things, and maybe fashion allowed us to be a little bit subversive in that way. We were also going to show some of Jonathan's pieces within the show. And I think Jonathan Anderson has been he's a really important figure in contemporary fashion and contemporary British fashion. And also he's had a real interest in kind of, I suppose, subverting traditional ideas of gender and kind of manipulation of body form as well. And at the same time, I think his pieces are really crafted and really technically, they're kind of incredibly made, as modeled by Tom in our studio. This is Tom Emerson, my co-director. And I think actually having it in the studio was also really important to us, because we could literally try it on, but we could touch it, we could see how it could be hung, how we could display it. So Jonathan Anderson, he sent us a box of kind of a lot of historic pieces from his collections, so we could get a feel for it. And then following Saul Steinberg's illustration, we started to set up these kind of groupings of pieces in conversation in these kind of domestic room sets. And it was also important to make views through the exhibition so that we didn't have to rely on wayfinding, that you would naturally find your way through, and also that we could find our own space within the big gallery volumes. We also paired fabrics with the pieces. And spatially, we kind of arranged it so we had a series of large rooms and smaller rooms, and that was so that you could have kind of individual conversations, a bit like a cocktail party. A couple in the corner, or a kind of grouping in the larger rooms, or several groups in the large rooms. And that spread out, we find these geometries kind of amongst the existing geometries of the Hepworth-Wakefield. And then we made a series of curtains which formed the backgrounds for the works and kind of layered themselves as well behind. And J.W. Anderson, Jonathan's brand, gave us a book of their dead stock cloth and fabric. And dead stock fabric, it's basically the end of the production run. It's the stuff that's left over that you don't have enough to make more, that would just be leftover. So we were then able to use them to make the curtains, if they had enough material in certain places. And I think actually for us it was quite a serious point, because it was about really the provenance of materials and the provenance of where things come from, and also a sense to try and reuse something which is seen as waste and then converting it into something which is not waste, which is more primary. Also, they were just really extraordinary fabrics, really beautiful prints, patterns, and somehow it kind of flavored the exhibition with some of the like wit and humor of J.W. Anderson, but in a kind of more subdued, maybe background kind of way. So here you can see some of the fabrics on display. Also even looking at kind of transparencies and so on. And we wanted visitors to be able to touch, to try to get a sense of what it was like to wear these things. So we worked with J.W. Anderson to make these kind of blown up versions, so really long arms and big torsos, so that you could kind of play with them, basically. And alongside that, maybe on a similar theme, Jamie Hawksworth, who's been a long-time collaborator with Jonathan Anderson, he took a series of portraits of local school children actually wearing the pieces. And I think this added a really interesting dimension to the whole exhibition, because it was also this kind of layer about self-identity and about imagination. And of course, image making in the fashion industry is a really central part of it. Not only to show the collections, but also to kind of create its own worlds and to communicate certain ideas. And I'm sure you're familiar with Jürgen Teller's work. He's probably made some of the most iconic fashion photographs and portraits of the last few years. It kind of also strikes me though that his work is very natural. It's kind of very intimate, and it's quite like situated and located. It can also be quite funny. So this is kind of well, I suppose it's not just funny, it's also, it kind of tries to get under the skin of things, and it looks in a kind of quite personal way at the thing that he's looking at, the subject matter, and quite often it's about the fashion industry itself. So this is quite a famous shot he took of Victoria Beckham modelling for Marc Jacob. And in a way he finds like the ordinary and the extraordinary in like one shot. And he asked us to find a place for him to work on a very long and thin site in West London. And so we designed a series of 3 buildings and 3 gardens that stretched along the site. And they were arranged kind of from the front to the back, getting more public at one side onto the street, so staff in the archive offices, and then getting progressively more private as we went through the studio to the kitchen and library and so on at the back. So it's 3 volumes, the offices, the garden, and the studio space, the garden, and then the rear volume, the kind of kitchen, the more domestic world. And as I say, it's a very narrow site, and it's basically bounded by residential Victorian backs. And we were literally kind of grafting the building onto the existing masonry wall. So this is us casting concrete up against the boundary walls. And it really kind of grafts on, it combines the existing brick with the new concrete. And the formwork boards that we use, we cut them all to the same height as the brickwork courses, so they kind of meshed in dimensionally. I like this pink smear as well. It's kind of like the de facto color of the construction industry nowadays. And basically, as we were starting on site, Jürgen was also there photographing it, and he's someone who works, I suppose, really opportunistically, that every opportunity is a chance for new photography. So it's a chance to discover something in the environment as you see it in front of you. So yeah, as we started construction, he was using it, kind of almost like a proto studio actually, because he was using it when it was mud and excavations. In fact, this is a shot of his yoga teacher for this book he produced. Yeah, kind of amongst the excavations. Really very opportunistic somehow. And for us, during the demolition process, we also identified some elements of the older buildings that we wanted to keep. So this T-shape, in a way that was kind of like an architectural opportunism, which then became these figures in the courtyard. And then they kind of became these opportunities for Jürgen Teller to use in his own photography. And that kind of process really panned out the whole way through the construction process. So this is a photo he took of a Japanese rock band called Boningen. This was one day before we were meant to hand over the building. And so it's on the rubble bags that have been left over by the contractor. He's still waiting for his last skip, basically. And we were also there, fortunately, right at the same time to photograph the building. And then out burst Jürgen and this rock band onto the street. But in a way, also, it was a really great moment because it meant that he was really using it. And he really does use it. He uses kind of not just the building itself, kind of almost every inch of it. He also uses the street in front of it. Kind of, it's very expansive type of practice. So you can see some of these, all of these are created on the street front. And then when we go inside the building, this is the arrival, and you get this long view the whole way through the site. And we really focused also on making the most of natural light, so trying to get top light all the way down through the building. So you go in, that pool of light, when you look up, you get this shot. So it's light dropping through the building, and then up into the office. And there's a big glass screen, which actually you can see through into the next garden. This is the office space, but the office space isn't just an office space, it's obviously also a place where he shoots. Everything's a kind of opportunity for photography. And then going out of the first building into the first garden. And the main studio in the middle is kind of framed by these two garden views. And then framed also back from the interior to the garden. And it's always a view to the garden and top light from above. And the top light from above, it was made by a series of north-facing roof lights, sloped up to the north. And then this column, this grid of like slender beams which run across the ceiling and dapple the light as it comes down through the building. It's very much a working studio, so people and objects and things, they keep coming and going. So it's made of quite robust materials, but the background walls are actually a white concrete block with white lime mortar. And they have this certain they're quite background, but also they have a certain softness to them. And this is Teller's portrait of Jonathan Anderson on the background. And he's holding a plate. This was a series, plate in German is Teller. So it was kind of a series about self-identity. There's quite a lot of plates around in the studio at certain points. And a lot of the project was about getting the details really well done, I think, and kind of using them as a game of composition and consideration because it's quite pared back as a building. So here, the wooden service trench, all our services run in that. And it's actually all those boards on top are old formwork boards. So they're all the old concrete, kind of remade. As a cover plate, also the floor box. And in fact, this is Jürgen taking a photograph of one of the floor boxes. So it's quite a high pressure environment for an architect because every detail somehow might end up in a photograph. So also like the staircases, they become kind of characters, but they also become backgrounds for his work. And this is an air vent to one of the storage rooms, and we got a decorative pattern in it. And then it reappears. He recently retook that photograph to celebrate kind of the 10-year anniversary of Victoria Beckham's own brand. So there she is with a water butt in the corner. And then moving from the main studio into the second garden space, this is it in the wintertime and then into the summertime. And then through there, we go into the kitchen space, which is obviously for photographs as much as it is for food. And even the sauna is an opportunity to kind of find an opportunity for photography, so trying to make a different feeling or a different atmosphere, a different physical sensation. And then we get to the back garden. This is the final garden. So a fire escape comes down from where that sauna was, down the staircase into the back garden. And that's maybe where we reconnect kind of with this background of Victorian London, the residential buildings, and then these huge tetrapanic plants, almost like these kind of jungle-like plants. And the gardens we designed in collaboration with Dan Pearson, and they were thought of as like a ruin, basically, and kind of these gaps between buildings, and could the nature of the city regrow in them. So we kind of broke out the concrete slabs and let the plants grow up through. And then this was quite a hairy moment. This was the Juneberry trees getting delivered right at the end of the construction process. And Jürgen was there also to photograph it. This is photographing the installation. And now the gardens are kind of 2 to 3 years on, and they're these really dense worlds of foliage. And somehow there's this very strong connection between nature and the buildings that runs the whole way through. And I suppose we like to see it that kind of humans are a part of nature rather than outside of it, alongside maybe the animals as well. And also alongside the seasons. So sunflowers in the summer, or like bare branches in the winter. And I suppose maybe in light of the conversation about fashion, it's thinking about seasons as more than just like new collections, but instead can they return us instead to the idea that fashion, nature and our environment are all profoundly connected and linked, even if it's kind of in their own very unique way. Thank you. Yeah.
The picture you had of the Paul Smith bag, the pattern, it kind of calls the question ownership of our intellectual property versus what we give to the client. I wondered if you get any thoughts of that when you saw that image.
We did actually. They did actually ask us if they could reproduce it, and of course we said yes. In fact, they were very sweet about it and kind of how they, in fact, we've been giving away one of the leatherware goods as part of our Christmas raffle every year. So it's been quite a nice thing. Like a few people in the office have, their wallet has got the Albemarle Street circles on it. So. Anyone else? Yeah.
Obviously, the name 6A doesn't, unlike Paul Smith, it doesn't suggest a brand or a name that's there. It's interesting to know in your office how maybe it varies between projects, but typically how would the design process work in terms of do you work as a group or is there design directors?
So maybe I should explain where 6A, the name, comes from. 6A was our very first studio address. It's 6A Ord Hall Street, which is the street we moved about 5 years ago to the next street over, but it's kind of a little small studio in Bloomsbury. We as a practice are now about 32 people, so we're kind of a middle-sized practice, and we have 4 directors. So there's Tom and Steph, Tom Emerson, Stephanie Macdonald, who founded the practice, and then there's John Ross and myself. And I suppose in a way our studio is very grassroots about how it designs, that the design comes from everywhere. It kind of comes bottom up and in all directions, that we really encourage everyone in the studio to have design ideas and to push forward a design. It's kind of very much not a top-down type of system. I think design ideas they're good no matter who they come from. And I think we're much more interested in maybe the kind of European system of like ateliers, where you're each architect or even assistant, we have part 1s and part 2s running projects. They are responsible for the creative as much as the professional and intellectual output of the work. And of course there are systems around them, managerial ones, support ones, kind of hopefully intellectual ones as well, which encourage the best work. But really we try to make it as fluid as possible in a way. It's quite a working studio. It's quite a live place. Hopefully that's the ambition at least.
Sounds like a nice ethos. Maybe tricky for making decisions, or does it pan out well?
I think actually that maybe in a way we are products also of the English academic system, which is a system based on discourse and critical thinking. And I think lots of people, I suppose the thing we value in the studio is sharp intellects and critical thinking and the ability to debate and question. And I think generally when you go through those procedures, there is quite often a collective understanding about why one thing would go in one way rather than another way. And therefore actually you quite quickly coalesce into a direction. And I think actually it's also we're a big office, but we're also a small office. It's not like, you know, we have hundreds of people in multiple levels. So it's I think you're in a group and almost in a peer group where you get on with each other and you can discuss and debate, and we're all from I suppose we can all see each other's points of view in it. So I think normally it pans out. And if not, I think it is up to the kind of four of us and also our associates and the project runners to decide. Because there comes a point, you know, when you can't endlessly talk or prototype or test. You just have to get something out for next Tuesday and get on with it.
How long did each project last?
So Raven Row, the actual building, we probably started in 2005 and ended in 2009. Then the exhibition was much faster. Exhibitions generally work on like 18-month cycles for the institution, maybe slightly longer for bigger institutions. So that means that the design part of it doesn't normally last any more than a year. Design and build part of it. So most of the exhibitions are done in kind of 3 to 6 months of quite intensive design and construction. Other projects, I mean, generally, it's quite an interesting topic because retail is usually fast because someone's taken a lease and then they need to get trading. And so you kind of, everyone burns the midnight oil, the contractor's building at the weekend and overnight, and it's a lot about speed. And I suppose in our case, some of them have been very much like that. Okini was really rapid, and some of the commercial galleries that we've worked on as well are really, really fast. You need to open for freeze and that's it. But some of the other retail projects, we've actually been able to kind of find space with the client to test things. So Hoston, for instance, we say that Hoston was about 2 years of discussion and about 1 year of building. And you can kind of see because it changed very much from the original ideas, both of us and the client, to then where we ended up and who else was involved in the project. Like the kitchen came in whilst we were in construction. So we had to fit in, they just got a Michelin star just before Christmas. So we had to fit in this very high level professional kitchen into this bit of Victorian building, as well as juggling all the other things that were going on. So that one was quite an unusual animal and quite slightly different shape. But yeah, that's that answer. Hey.
I just want to, your lecture conversation a lot about fabric and how these, unlike every level of that, looking for fabric. And when I think about like high fashion, like runway fashion, I think about these big forms that are created. So I just wanted to know how you get to form. Is it as a result of the fabric, or what does the form often inform the fabric?
I don't know, I think with that, we have to be quite careful about the different analogies, because I know that I think one of the problems with talking about fashion and architecture is that there have been so many examples of architects designing fashion pieces or fashion houses talking about architecture. And actually, I just see them as two entirely different disciplines, and they don't necessarily benefit from treading on each other's toes in such a direct, formal way. Like, we don't want to make a bag for someone in something like that. So, but I think the analogy maybe of fabric is a really useful one because it helps to tie the idea of, I suppose, the passing of ideas and culture and even decorative things from one country to another, or increasingly just between different groups of people. And that's really been quite interesting. And also the fact that it is natural. It's human, but it's also natural. And maybe in a world now where we've got to think about how separate we consider ourselves from our resources or from other species or generally from the planet, I think weaving and fabric is a really useful way of tying them all together. There's a really good book by Tim Ingold, a series of books he's an anthropologist. He looked a lot at weaving. And I'm not going to paraphrase it because he has his very own unique language. But one thing that really stuck out for me, I remember reading, was when he described a carpenter as being a weaver and saying that actually, if we think about the origins of carpentry, it was about finding the right shaped bit of tree that would fit that bit of roof framing, and that you were kind of weaving one piece with another piece and tailoring the cuts to put it together. And he basically says that weaving, it can be seen as the origin of all making. And in a way I can kind of understand that way, that sort of description. So I think for us maybe the idea of weaving and fabric is kind of quite a useful one as people who make stuff and design things. I think in terms of form, weaving is also kind of an interesting piece, because you remember the image of the straw hat. If you think about a straw hat, it's one material, but then it's woven in a way which gives it three-dimensional form. It could be flat, it could be any shape, and actually kind of using the physics of the material, this kind of structural composition of the material, being true to it and realizing the potential of it, I think is something that we like to do. But I wouldn't say it's directly kind of not formally generative in that way, if that makes sense. Does that answer your? Yeah. Cool. Hey.
Have you seen at all the kind of faster quickness, the fast pace sort of search for novelty in the fashion world seep into the architecture world at all? Are there sort of, because you have experience of both the fashion and the architecture world, do you see that becoming, like now with social media and everything, do you see trends in architecture now becoming a quick sort of aesthetic?
I think that maybe like the actual speed of construction hasn't changed, but I think definitely visually, image making wise, we are much more kind of quicker turnover of images, and people are much faster at processing how they see images. I mean, I'm probably my generation like straddled the digital non-digital thing, especially in architecture school. But now I think for you guys who've you see so many more images than I ever did when I was an undergrad, and also I think that means that you pass at least the kind of you kind of see the trends happening much quicker, and things. I've even noticed, I look at a lot of the portfolios that come into our office, and it's so much more sophisticated than it was when I was a student. But I think it's also a danger in a way. I mean, it's a great thing because it means you're all much more visually, I think, aware, whether you have the ability to see much more stuff. But it's also about remembering that that's only one part of what it is that makes up the content, and actually it can sometimes potentially be a bit of a camouflage to maybe the other types of knowledge that we like to have, and the other types of questions and discussions that we like to have in our studio. Anyone else? Right, last one maybe?
What are the main differences between designing for fashion and for sort of residential, would you say?
I think I probably have to caveat that by saying pretty much every project we do just has to be different, because there's no one building, there's no one person, there's no one site that is the same as each other. I think probably, well, the types of buildings you make are really quite different. But at the same time, I suppose we find in quite a lot of those projects there's a certain sense of domesticity in a way. A lot of people have said to us, "Oh, but isn't the Jürgen Teller photography studio actually his house?" And it's like, no, it's a working building. But I can understand maybe why people look at it like that. I think that's maybe more because our studio has a real interest in what the domestic environment might tell us about kind of human activity and human enjoyment in the environment. So like paying attention to the details, having stuff that's nice to touch, not making things feel institutionalized or plasticky unless you want them to. And I think quite a lot of the world, like maybe I can say it like this, it's quite easy and cheap to make things flat and smooth these days. And it's quite difficult to make things rough and uneven. And that's kind of a paradox that like standardization in the construction industry has birthed in the last, I think even probably the last 25 years, that it's gone from like doing one thing one way to the other thing that way. And that's something that maybe it will change, particularly when we think about alternative building materials going forwards. But then again, even things like CLT panels, which should be this amazing organic, very descriptive wood, is quite often just a blank surface of kind of relatively pale blonde wood. And somehow I think that this idea of, like we're quite interested in standardization and non-standardization and using them in the right ways and rubbing them up against each other in the right ways as well. And maybe that's kind of shorthand for the domestic, whereas actually we think it's quite a lot bigger and hopefully I think can be applied to very large buildings as well as small buildings. Great, maybe we can end it there.